Today we're ranking all 127 echoes based on how much tri-power they use and how useful they are for navigation or combat. Let's begin with D tier, which contains the 12 most useless echoes in the game. The ancient orb and animal statues are only used to solve a puzzle in the main quest. They're not really relevant outside of the one time you need them, so they belong in this bottom tier. The only other non-enemy in D tier is the lava rock. It's supposed to help you stand on lava, but it's too expensive, so you can't place more than one of them at a time. That means you would be hard pressed to cross a pool of lava while placing only one at a time. As far as enemies go, the Zol is probably the weakest one in terms of attack power, speed, and durability. It's not good at moving or dealing damage, and it dies instantly. The Beacon seems like a waste of tri-power since it doesn't help you deal damage. The Sand Crab can move a little faster, but only in one direction, and the Mini Moldorm is incapable of targeting enemies. The Beetle moves slightly faster than the Zol, but it still won't do much for you by itself. And finally, the Hoarder is okay, I guess, but it's too expensive and doesn't have any qualities that make it stand out as an echo. In C tier, we'll find echoes that are moderately useful once in a while, such as the 3 pots, which all seem to work the same. You can throw them directly at an enemy, or use them to distract an enemy, and you can even get into one yourself. That seems okay, but there's not a lot of situations where it's the best option. The rock is primarily useful for throwing at enemies in the early game, or standing on top of it to reach higher. The soft bed has a lesser use case than the other 2 beds, since the old bed is best for climbing, and Zelda's bed is best for healing. It can be the best for healing before you get Zelda's bed though. The carrot is used to summon your horse, but this has limitations. If the horse is nearby, but it can't reach where the carrot is, it'll try and get as close as it can. But as far as I know, you can't use the carrot to help your horse climb a wall or something. The rock roast is effective at distracting rock type enemies, but you don't have to deal with these as often as other types. I'd say the same about the stuffed toy, which distracts ghost type enemies. I've only seen them in one really niche area, so it's rarely needed. Getting into some enemies, both levels of the spear moblin are in C tier. In theory, they can keep themselves safe by attacking from range, but in practice, I find the close quarters enemy just catches up to them and beats them anyways. The sword moblin seems to deal good damage, but it lacks a defense mechanism, so it dies really quickly. The Lizalfos seems pretty agile, but doesn't excel at dealing damage. The Dark Nut is the opposite though, as it has good offense and defense, but is really slow. The Gibdo kind of works the same way, as it seems resistant to regular attacks, but it's relatively weak against elements, especially fire. It just isn't fast enough to put it any higher though. The Rope made it up to C tier because at least it has speed, and you can send a group of these to attack from far away. They work especially well if the enemy can only hit one at a time. The Torch Slug and Freeze Slug can be useful if you need their elements, but since they can't target enemies or anything, that makes it difficult to use them effectively in combat. The Hole Mill is necessary to dig through holes in Gerudo, but otherwise it doesn't seem like much of a threat when used as an echo. The Needlefly seems to pride itself on being smart, but I don't need my echoes to be smart, I just need them to deal damage. And I find it often loses if the enemy is just better at throwing hands. The Hydrazol is only a little bit better than the original, because you can increase its size and therefore its attack range. It also has a good matchup against fire enemies, of course. However, if you increase its size, that makes it easier to hit. The Tangler moves in a straight line, but this gives the enemy time to move before the Tangler makes it there. That makes it better in 2D areas than 3D though. The Piranha and Sand Piranha can move around well, but I noticed that they stop for a moment before attacking, and in practice, this can leave them vulnerable to getting hit before they can attack. The Deku Baba seems incapable of swallowing most enemies, unless maybe if they're really small, and if they can't swallow, then their opponent will usually be able to beat them first. The Wind Cannon is primarily used to blow piles of sand, but you can also use it to keep enemies at a distance. A more aggressive way to use it could be to just blow them off a cliff. The Aruoda seems pretty good at lining itself up for an attack, but the problem is it can only attack a very specific point, so that makes it stronger in one-on-one situations instead of dealing with groups. The Tektite can be really potent if it lines up its attacks correctly, but against a moving enemy, this can be difficult to do in practice, so its best use case is against enemies that don't move, although most of the enemies are mobile. Finally, the Elemental Keys are solid, but just plain too expensive. I'm not paying 4 tri-power for these since they're lacking in durability. In the B tier, we have some structures and creatures that are useful in a variety of situations, and return decent value on their tri-cost. The table is really helpful if you just want to move up half a block. There's a surprising amount of situations that require you to jump a full block, so the table is very helpful and stable in those situations. The wooden box gives you the full block, but you can't jump on top of it right away, unless you have the accessory that increases your jump height. It's especially helpful when you need to get out of the water. The boulder can also help with building, but I find that it's best used as a disruption to enemies. For example, sword enemies will hit it and then get knocked back for a couple seconds, and this can create openings for you or your other echoes. The appeal of the decorative shrub is that it's really tall, so obviously it helps you climb high up, but also you can cross a gap without losing height. The sign only has one use case that I know of, and it's for a technique called wrong warping. This is mostly used in speedruns to skip to the final boss, so that's really powerful if you're the right person, but otherwise it doesn't seem very useful. The ice block is a bit more sturdy than a wooden box, and if you push it, it'll slide across the ground. You can get creative with using these, but it doesn't have one central use case like the others. The snowballs can be really good at taking down small enemies, but on the other hand, they're really fragile. You can cover up this weakness by spawning them repeatedly when they break. The grilled fish and meat are useful as bait, just like the ones in C tier. The difference with these is that they apply to a higher number of enemies. I haven't unlocked the firework yet, but it seems very useful as an anti-air weapon. You do have to position it under the airborne enemy, but it deals a lot of damage when it's lined up correctly. The Dripatoon can help your electric type enemies such as the Spark, and the possibilities for what you can combine this with will expand as you play. But if for some reason you need a lot of water, this will provide that. The Armos has a similar use case to the Boulder, except it moves in a straight line. This can be for better or for worse depending on your situation, so I have them in the same tier, serving a similar purpose. Both levels of the Club Borblin made it to B tier. I really like how they jump before attacking, because I'd much rather them be vulnerable after their attack than before. They don't have the same problem as the weaker echoes who get knocked off their attack course and can't deal any damage. The Boomerang Borblin seems superior to the Spear Moblin because they hit multiple enemies at a time. Boomerangs also seem to cover a wider area than a spear would, so they're much better at dealing with groups. The level 2 Sword Moblin has a shield, and this helps it win almost any matchup against an enemy that doesn't have one, unless they're significantly stronger. The level 2 Lizalfos can do a huge jump to get behind an enemy, and that usually allows it to land the first strike. The level 2 Dark Nut can do a spin attack that helps it deal with groups, and it's also extremely durable. The level 2 Gibdo would have its same problem with the small attack range, but if you want, you can willingly light this one on fire and have it turn into a Redead, and that's an enemy I have higher on the tier list. The range from the Redead screams will massively increase the options you can have with the level 2 Gibdo. The Coromadillo has a clear use case, and that's when the walls are closed in. It can just bounce all over the place and tear up the room, so it's really nice when you're in close quarters. Both levels of the Mothula are pretty decent in the air, and I don't have much else to say about them, except that the level 2 is a little underwhelming for 5 tri-power. The Albatroll and Quay will give you some cheaper air-to-ground options, so with these you can win matchups against ground enemies that have trouble hitting the birds in the air. All 3 Octoroks are here because their lack of mobility is balanced out by the heavy damage they can deal. The level 2 Tangler has the additional use case of helping you light up a dark area. It's especially strong in those 2D water sections, so its use cases are more clearly defined. The Biodekubaba seems more capable of swallowing enemies, and you can use it in the water. So just like the level 2 Tangler, it's overall more useful and better at its job. The P-Hat seems to be really good at dealing damage, but in exchange for this, it takes a while to get revved up, and it's easy to knock it off its course. I find it's best to use Bind on the P-Hat so you can have better control over its movement. The giant Gopunga flower seems more effective when the enemies are closer to it, but that also means inviting them to deal damage. Again though, you could use Bind to hold the enemy in place and make sure it gets hit by the flower. The Gyro has similar use cases to the Wind Cannon, but has the added benefit of staying airborne, so you can also use this to blow enemies off a cliff. The Baby Goma isn't too strong, but has a good amount of utility since its webs slow down enemies. It opens up the additional option of lighting the webs on fire and dealing damage that way, so it's a good supporting piece if you're throwing out several enemies. The Goo Spectre is almost impossible to hit before it attacks, but the trade-off is that it's really exposed afterwards, so because of this it usually ends up trading with its opponent. The Lever may look like it's attacking, but honestly it might be better used for defense. It's pretty difficult to deal damage to it when it's constantly spinning around. The Gustmaster has a couple different use cases. You can propel enemies away, or you can propel yourself, especially when you stand on top of it and get propelled upward. And then there's the Snowball. It has similar strengths to the Caramadillo, but it can send snowballs to bounce across the room without having to move itself. It's good against ground-based enemies that have a difficult time targeting its head. Now we're moving up to A tier, which contains echoes that are especially good at their jobs, or are widely applicable. Zelda's bed will heal you twice as fast as the soft bed. After you've finished a battle, you may not even feel like healing up if it takes too much time, but Zelda's bed makes the amount of time you spend trivial, so you can heal up after every battle. The trampoline will give you a little more height when you need it, so all of those annoying jumps that you can't clear by yourself become easy with this. You can also stack them on top of each other to go even higher. The Brazier is good whenever you need fire, and it's that simple. It keeps you warm on the cold mountain, it can light objects or enemies on fire, and it's used in a variety of puzzles. The Ignazole serves basically the same purpose, but it's more mobile and temporary than the Brazier. That one's probably better if you want to light enemies on fire, since it can attack by itself. The Ribbitoon can draw its enemies' attention towards itself, and take their attention off you or your other echoes. You can use the moment where they're distracted to strike and wipe out all the enemies. The Tornado can blow enemies extremely far away, and it's especially good since it can move by itself. Instead of using it to push enemies across a cliff, you can also use it to push yourself. The Buzzblob and Beery are both helpful for shocking enemies in combat, and that gives you a big opening to strike. The only difference is whether they're useful on land or water. The Redead can stun all the enemies nearby, giving you a similar opening to if they were shocked, but in a wide area. They can also deal decent damage if they happen to be close to the enemy that's stunned, but they're fantastic when they're not alone. The Wizrobes have elemental advantages, and they're highly mobile with their teleports. They're usually a great option, but they're not as durable, and sometimes they miss their targets if they're far away. The regular Keese made it up to A tier, and unlike the other enemies that are 1 tri-power, these are effective against strong air enemies, and especially so against ground enemies that can't hit them in the air. You can swarm someone with these, and they'll have a really tough time dealing with them. The Wolfos runs around at an extremely fast speed, and it uses this agility to win most of its fights. The Chompfin, meanwhile, is just the king of water enemies. This will win in almost any situation where you're fighting something in the water. The Deku Baba level 2 made it up here because of its durability. Since it's not weak to blunt force attacks, it has a much easier time swallowing its enemies. The level 2 Caramadillo and level 2 Tektite are simply bigger, faster, and stronger. All of those are extremely helpful when we consolidate them in the same echo. And of course, all of the level 3 enemies made it up here. The Sword Moblin shines because of its quick stab after blocking with a shield. The Lizalfos shines underwater and with its mobility. And the Darknut is an absolute machine that can spin for a long period of time. The Ball and Chain Trooper is one of my personal favorites. It deals a ton of damage at close range when it spins the ball, and has the option to reach enemies from far away. If you like explosions, the Zero will provide plenty of those. You can pick up the bombs and throw them at enemies, especially the rock types. The Poe is extremely hard for its enemies to track down, since it will naturally go away from them, leaving fire in its trail, and it can even go through walls. So it's great on defense and can set up traps with its fire for you or your other echoes. The Moa is small, fast, and can deal damage from range, and that makes it extremely difficult to track down. The level 1 Genie is also really fast and has the advantage of going through walls. So if you're in a room that has a lot of barriers, this can go right through them and give you an advantage. The level 2 is much bigger and stronger, so it deals more damage in a wider range, with the drawback of taking more damage. The crow will give you rupees when it hits an enemy, so it's very useful to increase your bankroll when you're not worried about winning the fight. The freeze art has been extremely difficult for me to deal with personally, since it can freeze you from range and prevent you from getting closer. It's especially dangerous in combination with something else. The spark requires a little more brain power to use properly, but if you find a good spot for it, it's almost unstoppable. It moves really fast and covers a ton of area, and that mobility is something the other electric enemies don't have. The BMOS gets better at dealing damage the more enemies there are in the room, so if you can protect it from getting hit, it can clear out a group extremely quickly. Finally, the Pathblade is amazing for navigating on the ground. It won't help you clear gaps or anything, but it's the fastest thing in the game for getting you from point A to point B. There's only 12 echoes remaining to put in S tier, and to make it in the top 10%, these have to be absurdly good at their jobs. Let's start with the old bed, which will help you with almost any platforming scenario. Making a staircase with the old beds will help you clear vertical gaps and horizontal gaps, so it's a quick and easy option for most situations where you need to clear something. The cloud, however, can go all the way up to infinite height, well, until the game stops you, but this has the added drawback that you can't stay on the cloud for long. So if you want to take your time setting something up, the old bed will be better, but if you want the highest potential, you'll find that in the cloud. Either of these can take you pretty much wherever you want. The plat boom can lift you up extremely high, and it also crushes the enemies underneath it. These are both extremely powerful, and the only drawback is you'll need some help getting on top of it. The flying tile is amazing for clearing horizontal gaps. It takes you extremely far in a much shorter time than it would take you with an old bed staircase or a cloud staircase. The spiked roller is just extremely obnoxious for enemies to deal with. You can send this wide-ranging structure at them, and once it breaks, you can keep sending them one after the other. Genuinely, I can't think of a ground enemy that can deal with this, except for the extremely high tier ones. The Crawlchula is the king of climbing up walls. You can bind yourself to it and follow it no matter how high you have to climb. The Strandchula has the opposite use case, since it helps you clear dungeons. You can get all the way up to the ceiling to reach certain areas, or protect yourself from enemies. The Lionel is simply the strongest echo you can summon, so it's extremely powerful, but you have to wait until you've unlocked all your tri-power. The White Wolfos also stood out to me though, since it can repeatedly summon more enemies, and they're all extremely agile. Somehow, the Sea Urchin made it all the way up here. You can place a bunch of these and just have the enemies run into them for you. In large numbers, they're almost impossible to deal with. The Bombfish simply gives you a bomb whenever you need one, and to be honest, there's very few situations where a bomb is not helpful to me. It can blow up structures, even on land, and just take enemies down with it. But the best echo in the game, in my opinion, is the Water Block. You can stack them on top of each other or in front of each other to clear both vertical and horizontal gaps. And if you drag most enemies into it, they'll drown and die instantly. So having that power with navigation and insta-killing enemies is insane. Thanks for watching. Let me know if there's an echo you'd rank differently, and I'll see you next time.